SRN. Well, the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, says the budget sets a, quote, sensible path back to surplus in 4 years' time. But before then, the budget will continue to be buffeted by the second biggest write-down in revenues since the Great Depression, forcing this government to make a number of spending cuts, including scrapping the baby bonus, which we've been discussing this morning. The Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey, joins us now here in the Parliament House studios. Shadow Treasurer, good morning.
Good morning, Fran.
Wayne Swan says this budget presented a clear choice: protect jobs and growth and fund disability care and education reform. Was that the right choice?
Well, if the budget is focused on jobs and growth, then the Treasurer needs to explain why the budget forecasts higher unemployment, therefore it's not about jobs, and slower economic growth. Therefore, you'd argue it's not about economic growth. See, this is all spin. And I think the budget is fundamentally dishonest. I think there are a number of aspects of the budget that make a joke of Wayne Swan's claim to deliver a surplus. And just as you couldn't trust the government last year, and there's no regret, no apologies from this government about its failure to deliver surpluses, how can you believe what they're saying today?
It's pretty easy just to say this is a dishonest budget, though. What exactly is dishonest in this budget? Give me a concrete example.
Sure, I'll give you a very good example as a starting point. This year, the mining tax, as we predicted, has hardly raised any money, about 200 million. That's right. The budget forecasts a surplus in the third and fourth year. That'd be the fourth term of the Labor Party in government. They forecast a surplus and they claim that there's going to be $2 billion a year from the mining tax. That's based on assumptions that are indeterminable in the budget, because they're actually forecasting that iron ore prices are going to fall, that the terms of trade are going to fall, and that the Australian dollar remains around parity with the US. Now, when you look at that technical argument, you say to yourself, hang on, how are they getting this number? Secondly, for example, the carbon tax. Currently, the carbon price for 2015-16 for Europe is trading at around $6 or $7 a tonne. This government is saying that in 2015, Europe's going to trade at $12.10 a tonne. Now, when you try and work out how they've done it, they've drawn a line from the current market price to what they have to have at the end of the decade of $38 a tonne, and they're saying, well, if you go along that line, you can see $12.10 in 2015-16.
It's hard, though. It's hard to get those things right, given what we've just seen happen to the carbon price in Europe over the last 18 months, isn't it? Well, it's plummeted in a way that people didn't predict.
No, we did. We've been saying this, Fran. We've been saying it repeatedly. The mining tax is hardly going to raise $1. We're right. And we said Labor's never going to deliver a surplus, and we're right. In fact, I was just looking at your interview. But originally
with the carbon tax, you and others were saying the government's just using this as a cash cow. You thought it was going to raise billions of dollars.
And in this year and next year, it is raising billions at inflated prices, well above multiples of what it's currently trading at on the world market. We're paying the highest carbon price. But when it is linked, which is what was announced by Greg Combet not that long ago, when we hitch our economy to the Europeans, and why you want to do that, only Labor would know, but they're hitching our economy to the Europeans, and by doing so, they're tying our price to theirs, and their assumptions in the budget are massively over what the markets are saying Europe will trade at.
Some of this will come directly to you for a tick or a cross. You yourself have declared an end to the age of entitlement, and we've spoken about that before. I'm just assuming you will support, then, legislation to abolish the baby bonus.
Well, the government made announcements about changes to the baby bonus in last year's budget, and they have never introduced the legislation in a whole 12 months. In fact, the government has failed so far to introduce legislation to give effect to $28 billion of savings. They haven't even introduced the legislation.
Well, that aside, what's your position on the baby bonus?
And what we're saying is, we have always said we want to see the details of what the government presents.
Well, we've got the details now. They're going to scrap the baby bonus altogether and put a top-up payment on family tax benefit A.
We will consider it carefully, Fran. I hope you can understand, and your listeners can understand, our caution in just having a knee-jerk reaction to every single initiative that was announced a few hours ago, because that's exactly what Labor does. And I'll make the point, everything they said in last year's budget has been wiped by this year's budget. So they can't even hold programs for 12 months or promises for 12 months In this budget, they've got expenditure out 15 years. I've seen all these statements from the government. Oh, we're spending, enormous amount of money on infrastructure. It's not actually in this budget. It's not in next year's budget or the year after or the year after.
No, it's a national infrastructure plan.
Yeah, it's going for generations. But their savings are identified for today. There's no structural savings that are actually linked to the National Disability Insurance Scheme that haven't been spent other than the new increase in the Medicare levy. So
back to the baby bonus. Stuff. Okay, you don't want to say precisely what you do. You say you've only just got this. But, for instance, as you say, last year the government suggested already scaling down the baby bonus, so I guess you've had a good look at that. Given that you've said...
It's different to what they said this year.
No, it is, but it's nevertheless scaling it down. Given you've said it's time to reset people's expectations of what government can and should do for them... Are you generally in favour of adjusting the level of the payments, whether it's a wipeout altogether or making it less generous?
Well,
you must have a position on that by now.
Of course I do, and I will discuss my position with my colleagues and we'll go through the details.
The nation's listening to you now, Shadow Treasurer.
Well, I think I owe my colleagues and I owe the Australian people a commitment that we are going to look very carefully at what is in this budget before we make rash knee-jerk
Can I ask you, as a father, you're a father of 3, I think.
Yep.
Labor says it costs, the new figuring, $2,000 to pay for all the things you need to tot up for your first baby. They went to Big W and got the costs. Is that about right?
Well...
Would you give them that?
It was a bit more for us by the time you have 3 car seats for children under 5 and 6. So, look, Fran, there are pressures on families, and I know that. And there are a whole lot of cost pressures on families. I think the reason why we're in this position is because the government just hasn't done its job. Now, I picked out, can I give you praise, Fran, on this occasion? Give you praise, right? Last year you asked Wayne Swan in this room, if the surplus, Mr. Swan, is so important, the return to surplus, if tax revenues slip even further than forecasts, will you make more spending cuts to the budget to make sure the surplus is delivered, do or die? And he responded, yes. Now, you're right, Fran. If the forecasts don't add up, if the revenue doesn't come in, the government said, yes, we are going to do or die, deliver a surplus. Now they're saying they're never going to deliver a surplus, to be fair. They're never going to deliver a surplus, not this year, not next year, not the year after. And by the way, they're not being honest about the fact that the debt is going to break through the current debt ceiling of $300 billion.
It's 8 minutes to 7 on breakfast. Our guest this morning is the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey. But Joe Hockey, are you being honest about the fact that there has been a dramatic turnaround and write down in revenues, turnaround in our terms of trade, that is not just due to government mismanagement? We're not getting the prices for our goods and exports and that we have in the past. If you are Treasurer in the future, you will have to face with that diminished revenue stream.
Well, we're not going to overpromise, Fran. For example, the economic growth number, which drives the revenue, is forecast to be 2.75% next year. The Reserve Bank came out a week ago and said, look, we think the band is between 2 and 3%. So what does Wayne Swan do in this budget? He says we'll go near the top of the band, 2.75%.
For growth?
Right, for growth. Yeah, that's right. It's near the top of the band.
But that's what the OECD said as well.
No. Well, the OECD runs off our numbers. So, come on. But the Reserve Bank says it's somewhere between 2 and 3%. So he goes for the top number and then assumes more revenue. And then
what would you do if you're Treasurer? Will you go for the bottom numbers?
I'll be more cautious. And I'll tell you why, Fran, because we are in a volatile world. And if you bank the bonus that you think you're going to get, and it doesn't come home, don't cry crocodile tears, which is what this government does. And I will not accept for a government that is getting $20 billion more revenue this year than last year and $22 billion more revenue next year than this year and every year after that. I do not accept their claims that they're writing down revenue. That is the biggest load of spin and codswallop I have ever heard. They're writing them down off their overly optimistic assumptions and then claiming the world has come to an end. And I just made this point, Fran. Terms of trade, even at their lowest point under this government, the terms of trade are still more than 10% higher than they were at any time under the coalition. And when Wayne Swan talks about the Australian dollar, you know, the high Australian dollar has forced his revenues down, do you know that the budget itself, the last two budgets, have forecast the Australian dollar to be above parity with the US, and this budget forecasts it as well. So all his claims are just absolute codswallop.
It's 5 to 7 on breakfast. Shadow Treasurer, we're nearly out of time, but the government's tried to lock in funding for Gonski and the NDIS. Disability care will be funded by reforms to private health insurance and retirement incomes,
which they've already spent.
You're committed to disability care. Is that how coalition government would pay for the disability insurance scheme?
Well, again, I think, and I've only had a few hours to look at it, but I think what the government's done is it's committing to the National Disability Insurance Scheme spending that they've already spent for other purposes.
How do you feel that?
Well, because
the levy is there.
Well, for example,
they haven't spent that.
Well, no, the levy, as I said, the levy is, as I said earlier, the levy is separate, but the levy only raises about, well, it's arguable, about 40%, but they're giving 25% of the levy to the states. So we're trying to, it's like peeling an onion trying to find it. Can you find a table, Fran? Can you find a table anywhere in the hundreds of pages of the budget that actually outlines line item by line item how they're going to pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme or Gonski? No. There's not a single table that we could find that says here is the expenditure for the National Disability Insurance Scheme over 10 years and here are the ways that we're going to pay for it. There is no table.
If you don't keep these savings, voters will quite rightly question your commitment to disability care until you tell us how you're going to fund it. Will Tony Abbott be doing something like that in the budget reply?
Well, I'm not going to give you. I'd love to give you a speech now, but I think it's important that, again, Fran, we do what our opponents don't, and we carefully consider all the details in this budget. It is a very political document on a scale that I have never seen. Of the 17 years I've been in federal politics, I haven't seen
pretty funny politics if you're trying to sell a $19.4 billion deficit.
Well, does it surprise you?
Well, it's almost time to go. Just one final question.
No.
You have been highly critical of the Treasury forecasts, not just for the deficit, also for the mining tax. Will you believe Treasury numbers if you win government and you are Treasurer?
Well, I'll be able to engage with Treasury in a different way, obviously, to Mr. Swan.
Why?
Well, because I've got private sector experience. I've previously been a Treasury Minister, and frankly...
Well, he's the Treasurer.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for Mr. Swan, wisdom and knowledge hasn't come through the air conditioning in the Treasurer's office.
Let me ask it another way. Have you been thinking about it? You could be Treasurer in 5 months' time. What you could do to make the forecasts any more reliable?
I have. I
what would you
always
do?
think about these things. Well, I would, if I were to become the Treasurer, and I say big if, Fran, because there's no hubris at all on our side, I can tell you, but if I were, then there would be a closer engagement with private sector. And that means actually a deeper engagement with businesses to find out exactly what's happening in business. And I think economists spend a lot of time looking at information that comes out of the Australian Bureau of Statistics and a handful of other areas, but actually speaking with business people, hearing what the challenges are, speaking to families or listening to families is the way you find out whether there is consumer confidence and whether they are prepared to have a go and try and build a more prosperous country.
Joe Hockey, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast.
Thank you, Fran.
Joe Hockey is the Shadow Treasurer. RN